I never thought the phrase Christ is King would become part of popular American dialogue. While the phrase has always enjoyed some affection amongst certain evangelicals and more traditional Catholics, historically, Americans have tended to express their political religiosity differently. If you're curious about how, see my video on the Christian founding of the United States. Today, there's a lot of discourse being flung around about what the phrase means and whether it engenders anti-Semitism. Like many cultural phrases which launched themselves into the zeitgeist, like Black Lives Matter or Make America Great Again, the phrase Christ is King can be a deceptively simple slogan. And this is why Megyn Kelly asked popular Catholic media ambassador Bishop Robert Barron about the phrase.
There's been a lot of back and forth about how if it's said to a Jewish person as like a, New York Giants suck, if there's an implication that this is the only, right? Like what, if you believe differently, then you're bad, then it's provocative and it's using the Lord's name in vain. Whereas if you just state it as this is my belief, this is my religion, this is what's in my heart, it's something totally different. But every day there's a debate like this going on in our news and our social media and so on. Have you seen that latest?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have a little bit. I just become aware of it. And a couple of things I'd say. One is the Feast of Christ the King within the Catholic Church was instituted in the early 20th century precisely by the popes who were recognizing the rise of fascism, and which often had a very deeply anti-Semitic quality. And they saw the danger of fascism was a deification of the state. So that's trouble with all forms of totalitarianism. The state becomes absolutized.
One of the things I love about Catholicism, which is pretty unique, honestly, is that the religion is very easy to pin down due to its hierarchical nature. So unlike Protestantism, Judaism, or Islam, its core tenets are spelled out in doctrines and in letters from authoritative figures within the religion. And so it's easy to check if somebody is mischaracterizing an aspect of it. There's not as much gray area of scholarly dispute to hide in. So we don't have to just say the popes and vaguely reference fascism. We can just read and see for ourselves what the doctrine says. And the Feast of Christ the King that Bishop Barron references here was promulgated in a letter of Pope Pius XI in 1925 called Quas Primas. Bishop Barron implies that this feast was against fascism and therefore against anti-Semitism. And that suits the sensibilities of Megyn Kelly's audience just fine, and I guess he's hoping that the audience doesn't read the actual text he's referencing because that implication might seem like more of a stretch. In fact, in the first of only 2 mentions of the Jews within the text, Pius XI does not reference fascism, but the 3-branched constitutional system of the United States, writing, "Let us explain briefly the nature and meaning of this lordship of Christ. It consists, we need scarcely say, in a threefold power which is essential to lordship. This is sufficiently clear from scriptural testimony, although adduced concerning the universal dominion of our Redeemer, and moreover, it is a dogma of faith that Jesus Christ was given to man not only as our Redeemer, but also as a lawgiver to whom obedience is due. Not only do the Gospels tell us that he made laws, but they present him to us in the act of making them. Those who keep them show their love for their divine master, and he promises that they shall remain in his love. He claimed judicial power as received from his father when the Jews accused him of breaking the Sabbath by miraculous cure of a sick man. For neither doth the Father judge any man, but hath given all judgment to the Son. In this power is included the right of rewarding and punishing all men living, and this right is inseparable from that of judging. Executive power, too, belongs to Christ, for all must obey his commandments. None may escape them, nor the sanctions he has imposed. Catholic social teaching tends to prefer broader ethical stances over strict prescriptions about how society must be organized. When critiquing capitalism, for example, you will never find a pope who teaches that the means of production must be seized by the proletariat. Rather, you will see them them warn against the evils of exploitation and of defrauding laborers of their just wages. This nod of Pius XI to the legislative, judicial, and executive powers of governance are, in those terms, a pretty direct call-out not of fascism, but of US-style constitutional liberalism. Of course, Pius XI was also critical of fascism, particularly of Italian fascism, most notably publishing a letter, Non abbiano bisogno, against Mussolini. But Bishop Barron is conflating and mixing these two things and then further injecting the Semitic non sequitur. I don't think this aids anybody's historical understanding of what the Catholic position on the kingship of Christ is. I would speculate, based upon his characterization, that he is trying to couch the issue in a more approachable and inoffensive way. He might think he's trying to keep everybody cool and moderate and integrate the thought that Christ is king into a more liberal worldview. That's my speculation, but misconstruing historical thought actually hurts moderation and liberalism in my view, because our perception of the world will be wrong, and we will therefore be more likely to be more frustrated based on intellectual boundaries we have set for ourselves. And so more practically, these misstatements narrow our minds and artificially confine our thinking according to the biases of our own times and our own pre-existing preferences. Therefore, we will fail to grow intellectually, which is bad enough, but further, we will diminish our chances of reaching, certainly not agreement, but at least authentic understanding of different points of view. Bishop Barron is treating the audience with kid gloves as though they can't handle that, but he is actually making them more close-minded and intellectually fragile by omission. Especially ironic when this failure is employed in the defense of liberalism, whose core concept rests on the essence of free exchange of provocative ideas, such as the one Pius XI offers to a 21st century American audience. Sure, Bishop Barron's statement might be offensive to tradcaths, but I think it should be off-putting to any liberal who has the simple and modest desire to just understand the actual perspective and not be coddled and catered to for fear will melt.
The fact that Pilate, who put over the cross of Jesus, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, right? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Well, we're meant to see the tremendous irony in that, is the one who has no worldly authority, the one who has no worldly power, no worldly honor, just the opposite, is the one who, in fact, is the king. So it's not playing the old game of, us against them, or I'm going to fight your king on his own terms and take his place. It's a revolution. It's a renewal of understanding. If you miss the irony of the declaration that Christ is king, you're missing the whole story.
I've heard this interpretation before, that Christ is king only of the heart, and that he's too good to be involved too much in worldly affairs. And if Bishop Barron were a Protestant pastor, this personal conviction would be just that. To me personally, this is a compelling point of view, but at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that it's a cop-out to try to, again, make the vision and impact of Christianity as culturally small and non-threatening as possible. I have to, again, conjecture that this is at least part of Bishop Barron's attitude here, based on how strangely cobbled together his earlier answer was, but even further based on the fact that the statement is explicitly repudiated within the text of Quas Primas. It has long been a common custom to give to Christ the metaphorical title of king because of the high degree of perfection whereby he excels all creatures. So he is said to reign in the hearts of men both by reason of the keenness of his intellect and the extent of his knowledge, and also because he is very truth, and it is from him that truth must be obediently received by all mankind. But if we ponder this matter more deeply, we cannot but see the title and power of king belongs to Christ as man in the strict and proper sense too. For it is only as man that he may be said to have received from the Father power and glory and a kingdom, since the Word of God, as consubstantial with the Father, has all things in common with him, and therefore has necessarily supreme and absolute dominion over all things created. Bishop Barron is not a pastor or a spiritual coach. He's a prelate of the Catholic Church, and what he just said is decidedly contrary to the very documents he references in order to justify his position. Whatever the reason, at least in this, Bishop Barron is very simply mistaken. But what about the broader implication here? How does this Catholic concept of Christ the King relate to the larger social trend? From a social standpoint, I think that the resurgence of this phrase is an attempt by Christians to reassert the historical cultural dominance enjoyed by Christianity in the US, which has been attacked and successfully eroded by many secularists, liberal Christians, and yes, by Jews seeking to shape the United States from a Christian nation into a more culturally amorphous sort of universal world home, one where anybody can be an American if they get their papers without distinction or deference to the historical preference of the nation, and therefore granting no pride of place to the traditional religion of the country. And in this way, saying that the phrase Christ is King is a cynical political cudgel is not totally wrong. Richard Dawkins, in his atheist preference for Anglo culture, might say Christ is King out of a sense of cultural utility. Is this the vision set forth by Pius XI? Not really. It is not global in its ambition. It is not nearly so strict in its prescription. And perhaps most importantly, it views the kingship of Christ more as a means than as an end in and of itself. I think from the Christian perspective, there's a case to be made that such usage of Christ's name in this way is wrong or blasphemous. Either way, though, the phrase is always an attempt to reassert Christian preference within American society. And yes, this is to the exclusion of the historical minority, Jews. And it was this narrower cultural vision which historically justified the state of Israel, as put by Theodor Herzl in his 1896 book, The Jewish State. We are a people, one people. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It has not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native land in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. The case for Zionism is precisely caused by the social kingship of Christ, which separates Jews from their European societies. This more pragmatic realization of Herzl's is strangely out of step with modern Zionists who do not acknowledge the legitimacy of the activating factor, the source of Jewish cultural alienation from Western societies, which made Zionism so essential to Herzl in the first place, that being the social kingship of Christ. And even though Herzl's quote displays a great deal of frustration with this fact, it does not seek to change this element of Western society, rather to exit it. If Jews can live just as well in the United States, there is far less reason for Israel to exist. Anti-Semitic? Well, if all religions ought to be treated equally, regardless of historical or cultural relevance, then yes, it is, although no more so than anti-Muslim, anti-Hindu, or anti-secular. And of course, belief in any religion is of its very nature exclusive. We don't colloquially call an agnostic anti-Christian simply for being agnostic. Ultimately, they are, and vice versa. The tacit assumption that seeking to assert Christianity over the United States is an affront to Judaism belies, in my opinion, an expectation that Judaism ought to occupy a co-equal space in the American public discourse, far more ambitious than Herzl would have imagined. And in this, it strikes me that American Jews ought to pick their pleasure. Either the United States is a historically Christian nation in which having at least a minority which seeks to assert that fact is to be expected and accepted, in which case the state of Israel is necessary as a true cultural homeland which they should emigrate to and support upon these grounds. Or the United States is equally as Jewish as it is Christian, in which case there is no need for the state of Israel on these grounds. But I digress. On this issue, as with so many on the internet, the inference of motive and the use of loaded language does not serve the truth. Trying to pigeonhole the conversation in order to fit modern sensibilities, as Bishop Barron did here, does not serve the truth. It only shuts down and agitates dialogue far broader and deeper than it at first appears. Pius XI, in Quas Primas, references the cultural memory of the Catholic Church stretching back to 325 AD. This Jubilee year marks the 16th centenary of the Council of Nicaea. We commanded that event to be celebrated, and we have done so in the Vatican Basilica. There is a special reason for this, in that the Nicene Synod defined and proposed for the Catholic belief the dogma of the consubstantiality of the only begotten with the Father, and added to the creed the words, "of whose kingdom there shall be no end," thereby affirming the kingly dignity of Christ. Ultimately, my personal opinion is that this issue is one which gets a lot more play on the internet than in real life. Nobody at my job is urgently talking about whether it is anti-Semitic to say Christ is king. But if you're going to say Christ is king, I think you should just go ahead and say it with your chest and let the chips fall where they may, as both Theodore Herzl and Pius XI seemed to expect. I don't think there's anything gained by shying away from honesty, from simply expressing the fullness of the perspective. Many people are not going to like it or agree, but hearing an alternative perspective, especially one which offers such striking insight into history and culture like this one, isn't going to kill anybody. It's going to inform them, and hopefully going to help them become intellectually anti-fragile. If some people can't handle the reality of history, the reality of a long-held, even ancient historical perspective, if they must swaddle themselves in the comforting retort of anti-Semitism, they will never even understand what it might mean to even have historically been a Jew in America. And upon what basis, then, do they even stand to say they oppose the statement Christ is king? Therefore, in his attempt to spare the feelings of the Judeo-Christian crowd, Bishop Barron has forgone an opportunity to explore the real historical contours of this phrase and sentiment. And because of this, he has done poorly. Intellectually, he has done poorly, regardless of the sensibilities of his audience about whether or not Christ really is king.